The flight that changed everything. The cabin of Flight 872, destined for LaGuardia Airport, hummed with the ambient sounds of passengers settling into their seats. Business people huddled over laptops and smartphones, whispering into headsets. Parents juggled energetic toddlers, attempting to keep them entertained for the duration of the flight. Among the hustle and bustle, a composed and elegant figure quietly took her seat in the first-class cabin. Justice Elaine Patterson, a highly regarded member of the United States Supreme Court, sat poised yet inconspicuous. Dressed in a custom emerald green Valentino dress that complemented her deep brown complexion, she exuded sophistication. Her Louis Vuitton tote sat neatly beneath the seat in front of her, its understated design betraying her status only to those who recognized the brand. She had chosen this flight for its convenience, departing Atlanta in time to bring her to New York City for a critical judicial conference on civil rights. The irony of what would transpire on this flight was something she could never have anticipated. Elaine's life had been a testament to perseverance. Born into a modest family in rural Georgia, she had risen through the ranks of the legal world with an unwavering commitment to justice and equality. Yet, she was all too aware that her accomplishments often did little to shield her from prejudice. Elaine's philosophy was one of patience and dignity. She believed in using moments of injustice to educate rather than escalate. This flight, however, would test her philosophy to its very core. The first indication of trouble came as she settled into her seat. A blonde flight attendant, Amanda Walsh, approached with a clipboard and a scrutinizing gaze. Amanda was in her early 30s, with sharp features and an air of superiority that seemed to follow her like a cloud. She surveyed Elaine with barely concealed disdain, her eyes lingering on the expensive fabric of the dress before narrowing slightly. "Ma'am," Amanda said curtly, her voice devoid of warmth, "you're in the wrong seat." Elaine looked up from her copy of a legal brief, her expression calm. "I don't believe I am," she replied evenly. She retrieved her ticket and handed it to Amanda, who glanced at it briefly before handing it back with a tight-lipped smile. "This section is reserved for first-class passengers," Amanda said, her tone dripping with condescension. Elaine met her gaze without flinching. "I am aware," she said, her voice measured. "As you can see, this is my seat." For a moment, Amanda said nothing. Her lips tightened into a thin line, and a faint flush crept up her neck. "Must be nice to get a free upgrade," she muttered under her breath before turning on her heel and walking away. Elaine chose not to respond, though her chest tightened with the familiar sting of being underestimated. She had spent a lifetime learning to navigate these moments, choosing her battles carefully. The irony was not lost on her that she was traveling to discuss civil rights while being treated as if she didn't belong in a space she had rightfully earned. As the flight progressed, Amanda's behavior grew increasingly hostile. When Elaine requested a glass of water, Amanda deliberately ignored her, attending to other passengers first. Another flight attendant, a younger woman named Sophia, noticed the tension and quietly brought Elaine the drink, murmuring an apology. Elaine offered a gracious smile, appreciating the small kindness. The situation escalated when Elaine stood to retrieve a book from her tote. Amanda, who had been passing through the aisle, stopped abruptly and blocked her path. "Ma'am, please remain seated until we've completed our service," Amanda said sharply. Elaine glanced at the cart, which was several rows away. "I simply need to retrieve something from my bag," she said calmly. Amanda's eyes flicked to the designer bag and back to Elaine. "I said remain seated," she snapped. Her voice was loud enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers, some of whom exchanged uneasy glances. Elaine took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I understand your protocol, but I assure you I won't interfere with your service. I'll be quick." Amanda's face flushed with anger. "I don't know what kind of flights you're used to, but we have rules here. If you can't follow them, you might want to reconsider where you sit." A murmur rippled through the cabin. A businessman sitting across the aisle lowered his newspaper, his brow furrowing. "She's not doing anything wrong," he said, his voice steady. Amanda shot him a glare, but said nothing, stepping aside just enough for Elaine to reach her bag. Elaine retrieved her book and returned to her seat, her composure intact, but her patience wearing thin. The tension reached its breaking point when the meal service began. Amanda delivered plates to the passengers in first class, skipping over Elaine entirely. Elaine waited, expecting her meal to arrive with the next round, but it never did. When she finally spoke up, Amanda feigned surprise. "Oh, I must have missed you," she said, her tone insincere. "I'll see if there's anything left." Before Elaine could respond, the businessman across the aisle interjected again. "This is unacceptable," he said firmly. "You've been nothing but rude to her the entire flight." Amanda turned on him, her expression a mix of indignation and embarrassment. "Sir, I don't think you understand." "No, I think I understand perfectly," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You're treating her this way because of how she looks. It's disgraceful." The cabin fell silent, the murmurs of other passengers fading as they turned their attention to the unfolding scene. Elaine felt a surge of gratitude, but also a deep discomfort. She hadn't wanted to cause a spectacle, but the situation was spiraling out of control. Amanda, clearly flustered, attempted to regain her composure. "I'm just doing my job," she said defensively. "Then do it properly," the man shot back. The argument seemed to ignite something in Amanda. Her professionalism crumbled, and she stepped toward Elaine, her voice shaking with barely contained anger. "I don't know who you think you are," she said, her voice loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "But people like you don't belong in first class." Gasps echoed through the cabin. Elaine stood slowly, her heart pounding. She was keenly aware of every eye on her, every breath held in anticipation. "Enough," Elaine said, her voice firm but calm. "This has gone too far." Amanda, perhaps realizing she had crossed a line, tried to backtrack. I didn't mean." "You meant every word," Elaine interrupted. Her voice was steady, but her eyes burned with intensity. "And I assure you, there will be consequences." Before Amanda could respond, the plane's captain appeared, summoned by a concerned flight attendant. He quickly assessed the situation, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm as passengers began recounting what had happened. As the captain escorted Amanda away to speak privately, Elaine sat back down, her hands trembling slightly. The businessman across the aisle leaned over and whispered, "You handled that with more grace than she deserved." Elaine offered a small smile but said nothing. The truth was, she was exhausted, not just by this encounter, but by the countless others like it that she had endured throughout her life. She could feel the weight of every moment when she had been underestimated, dismissed, or disrespected. What Amanda didn't know, what no one on that plane yet realized, was that Elaine Patterson was not just another passenger. She was one of the most powerful women in the country, a Supreme Court justice whose very presence in that first-class seat was a testament to the progress she had spent her life fighting for. And this was only the beginning. The unveiling storm. The cabin of Flight 872 remained tense after the heated exchange between Amanda Walsh and Justice Elaine Patterson. Passengers whispered among themselves, their glances oscillating between Elaine and the direction where Amanda had been escorted by the captain. Despite the heavy atmosphere, Elaine maintained her composure, though her mind raced with thoughts of the incident. This was not a moment she could let pass without action, yet she understood the importance of proceeding wisely. Seated once again, Elaine reached for her notebook, a leather-bound companion that had followed her through years of court cases and legislative debates. She flipped it open, her pen poised above a blank page. The quiet act of jotting down her thoughts was her way of regaining clarity. Every detail of the interaction was chronicled, from Amanda's initial hostility to her blatant escalation. This documentation, Elaine knew, would serve as more than a personal record. It would become evidence of systemic issues she had spent a lifetime addressing. Passengers around her continued to watch, though their scrutiny had softened into something else: admiration. The businessman who had spoken up earlier leaned across the aisle once more. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but firm. "I just wanted to say that what happened back there was unacceptable. If you need a witness, I'm more than willing to speak on your behalf." Elaine turned to him, her expression gracious but guarded. "Thank you. Your support means more than you know. I assure you, this incident won't be ignored." The man nodded, his resolve clear. It's refreshing to see someone handle this kind of thing with dignity. Not everyone could. Elaine offered a small smile before returning to her notes. The truth was, she didn't feel dignified. She felt weary. Decades of enduring microaggressions and outright discrimination had built a resilience in her, but resilience was not immunity. This encounter had cut deeply, not because it was unique, but because it was routine. Meanwhile, in the small galley at the back of the plane, Amanda stood stiffly before the captain, her arms crossed defensively. Captain Roberts, a seasoned aviator with over 20 years of experience, was not one to tolerate insubordination among his crew. "Explain yourself, Amanda," he said, his tone measured but firm. "I've received multiple complaints from passengers about your conduct, and I saw the tail end of it myself. What happened?" Amanda hesitated, her confidence visibly shaken. "Captain, I was just trying to enforce the rules," she said finally. "That woman was disruptive, and I—" "Disruptive?" Captain Roberts interrupted, his eyebrows arching. "From what I understand, she asked for a glass of water and retrieved a book from her bag. Hardly disruptive." Amanda flushed. She was being difficult, she insisted. "And let's be honest, people like her usually don't belong in first class." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Captain Roberts stared at her, his expression darkening. "People like her," he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "Amanda, do you even realize who that passenger is?" Amanda's confusion was evident. "I don't care who she is," she said stubbornly. "Rules are rules." The captain sighed deeply, pinching the bridge of his nose. "You might care when you learn that she's Justice Elaine Patterson. Yes, that Justice Patterson. One of the most prominent figures in the country, and might I add, a first-class passenger who has every right to be here." Amanda's face went pale. I didn't know," she stammered. "That's the problem." Captain Roberts snapped. "You made assumptions, and those assumptions have put us in a very precarious situation. Do you understand the gravity of this?" Amanda opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, she seemed to grasp the full weight of her actions. Back in the cabin, Elaine was approached by Sophia, the younger flight attendant who had quietly supported her earlier. Sophia knelt slightly to meet Elaine's eye level, her demeanor apologetic. "Justice Patterson," Sophia began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to apologize again for my colleague's behavior. It was unacceptable, and I want you to know that not all of us share her views." Elaine set her notebook aside, her gaze softening. "Thank you, Sophia. Your kindness hasn't gone unnoticed." Sophia hesitated before continuing. "The captain is handling the situation as we speak. I'm sure Amanda will face consequences, but if there's anything I can do to make this right, please let me know." Elaine studied Sophia for a moment, sensing her sincerity. "What you've done already means a great deal," she said. "Sometimes it's the small gestures that make the biggest difference." As Sophia departed, Elaine returned to her notes, her thoughts shifting from the incident itself to its broader implications. This wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others who faced similar treatment, but lacked the platform or resources to fight back. Her position as a Supreme Court justice gave her a voice, and she resolved to use it. As the flight continued, whispers about Elaine's identity began to circulate among the passengers. The businessman who had defended her earlier had discreetly shared the news with a few others, and the realization spread like wildfire. By the time the plane began its descent, a palpable shift in atmosphere had occurred. Passengers who had initially kept their distance now seemed eager to express their support. A woman seated across the aisle leaned over and said, Justice Patterson, I just want to say how much I admired your work. It's an honor to be on this flight with you. Elaine nodded politely, though the attention made her uncomfortable. She hadn't sought recognition on this flight. She had sought peace. Yet, the unfolding events had made that impossible. When the plane finally touched down at LaGuardia, Elaine felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She knew this wasn't the end of the ordeal. It was merely the beginning of a larger conversation. As the passengers disembarked, several paused to offer words of encouragement, their gestures reminding her of the collective strength found in community. Amanda, on the other hand, remained conspicuously absent, likely kept in the galley to avoid further confrontation. Captain Roberts himself stood at the cockpit door, his expression apologetic as Elaine passed. "Justice Patterson," he said quietly, "on behalf of the airline, I want to personally apologize for what happened today. Please know that we're taking this matter very seriously." Elaine met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I appreciate your acknowledgement, Captain," she said, "but apologies alone won't address the root of the issue. I trust your airline will take the necessary steps to ensure this doesn't happen again." He nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of her words. As Elaine stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, she was met by a staff member from the airline who offered to escort her to the exit. She declined politely, preferring to walk alone. The rhythmic click of her heels against the polished floor was a steady reminder of her journey, one that had been paved with challenges, but also triumphs. In the privacy of a waiting car, Elaine finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. She retrieved her phone and began typing an email to her assistant, detailing the incident and requesting that a formal statement be prepared. This was no longer just about her experience. It was about using her voice to advocate for others who had been silenced. As the car pulled away from the airport, Elaine gazed out the window, her resolve hardening. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, but then again, it never had been. And she was more than ready to face it. The quiet before the reckoning. Elaine Patterson sat in the back seat of the Blacktown car that glided through New York City's streets. The familiar sounds of honking horns and the murmur of life in the city buzzed outside, but she barely noticed. Her mind was a whirlpool of thoughts. The incident on the plane wasn't an anomaly in her life. It was a reflection of a society still struggling to confront its own biases. What unsettled her most was not Amanda Walsh's behavior, but the realization that millions faced the same treatment daily without the platform or power to fight back. As the car approached her destination, a historic hotel in Midtown, where the Civil Rights Judicial Conference was set to take place, Elaine was already planning her next steps. She knew she had to handle this situation delicately. A public figure like her could not afford impulsive actions, but silence was not an option either. Her assistant, Grace Turner, awaited her at the hotel entrance. Grace was a sharp, efficient young woman in her early 30s, with a knack for turning chaos into order. As soon as Elaine stepped out of the car, Grace approached, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "Justice Patterson," Grace began, falling into step beside her as they entered the grand lobby. "I've already drafted a preliminary statement regarding the incident on the plane. Would you like to review it before tomorrow morning?" Elaine nodded, her emerald Valentino dress catching the light as she moved through the space with purpose. "Yes, but first, let's talk strategy. This isn't just about one person or one airline. It's about a culture of exclusion that we can't ignore." Grace glanced at her tablet, nodding as she typed notes. "Understood. Should we frame this as part of a broader discussion on systemic inequality? Perhaps tie it into the themes of the conference?" "Exactly," Elaine replied. "This isn't about retribution. It's about accountability and progress." They reached the elevator, and Elaine allowed herself a small sigh of relief as the doors closed, shutting out the curious glances of onlookers. Inside the elevator, Grace's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. She glanced at the screen, her expression tightening. "It's already on social media," Grace said. "Passengers from the flight are posting about what happened. There are videos, quotes, Even someone identifying you as a Supreme Court justice. Elaine's eyebrows arched slightly, though she wasn't entirely surprised. Let me guess, people are already choosing sides. Grace nodded grimly. Exactly. Some are condemning the flight attendant's behavior, but there's also the usual backlash. Claims that you were playing the victim, or that this is being blown out of proportion. Elaine's lips pressed into a thin line. The court of public opinion moves faster than any judicial process, she said. But that doesn't mean we can't guide the narrative. Schedule a press briefing after tomorrow's panel. I'll address it directly. Later that evening, Elaine sat alone in her suite, staring out at the glittering city skyline. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. She had exchanged her elegant dress for a simple silk robe, letting herself relax for the first time since the flight. The silence gave her space to reflect, and with it came memories she hadn't summoned in years. Growing up in rural Georgia, Elaine had faced prejudice in its most overt forms. She remembered the first time she was told she didn't belong in an advanced math class, despite her straight-A record. She remembered her parents' whispered discussions, late at night, about whether their daughter would ever have the opportunity she deserved. But Elaine also remembered the mentors and allies who had supported her along the way. Her high school history teacher, who encouraged her to enter a national essay competition. Her college professor, who introduced her to the writings of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Each of them had played a role in shaping her path, and she carried their lessons with her even now. The incident on the plane wasn't new, but it struck a nerve. Elaine was no longer a child facing systemic barriers. She was a Supreme Court justice with the power to influence change. Yet even at the pinnacle of her career, she wasn't immune to the prejudice that had shaped her early life. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of her phone. A message from Grace appeared on the screen. Draft statement attached. Let me know your thoughts. Elaine opened the document, her sharp eyes scanning the text. It was well written, striking the right balance between personal experience and systemic critique. Still, she made a few edits, ensuring the message remained grounded in her principles. When she was done, Elaine set the phone aside and leaned back in her chair. She had faced adversity before, and she would face it again. But this time, she would make sure it served a purpose. The next morning, the conference began with the usual formalities. Judges, lawyers, and legal scholars from across the country mingled in the grand ballroom, exchanging pleasantries over coffee and pastries. Elaine arrived punctually, her presence commanding immediate attention. Dressed in a tailored navy suit with subtle gold accents, she exuded authority and grace. The first panel discussion focused on the theme of equality under the law. Elaine listened intently as her peers debated the nuances of legal frameworks designed to address systemic inequality. Yet her mind drifted occasionally to the broader implications of her own experience. Laws could only go so far if societal attitudes lagged behind. When it was her turn to speak, Elaine approached the podium with her usual calm demeanor. She began by addressing the conference's theme, weaving in historical examples and contemporary challenges. Her voice was steady, her words precise. But then she pivoted. Yesterday, she said, her gaze sweeping across the room, I experienced something that reminded me of the work we still have to do, not just in the courtroom, but in every corner of our society. The room grew silent. Elaine recounted the incident on the plane, her tone measured but firm. She didn't dwell on the details but used the experience to highlight the persistence of implicit bias and the need for accountability. What struck me most, she said, was not the behavior itself, but the realization that many would endure similar treatment without the means to challenge it. This is why our work matters. This is why progress must be relentless. Her words were met with a standing ovation. That afternoon, Elaine held a press briefing in a smaller conference room. Reporters packed the space, eager for a statement from the justice who had become an unwitting symbol of resilience overnight. Cameras clicked and questions flew, but Elaine remained poised. Justice Patterson, one reporter asked, how do you plan to address this incident moving forward? Elaine folded her hands, her expression thoughtful. "This isn't about me," she said. "It's about a culture that allows such behavior to persist. I've already spoken with the airline's leadership, and they've assured me that an internal investigation is underway. But this goes beyond one company. It's a societal issue, and it requires collective action." Another reporter chimed in. "Do you see this incident as a turning point in the fight against discrimination?" Elaine's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Every incident has the potential to be a turning point, but only if we're willing to learn from it. Change doesn't come from a single moment. It comes from a sustained effort to do better. And I intend to ensure that effort continues." As the day wound down, Elaine returned to her suite, exhausted but satisfied. The storm that had begun on Flight 872 was far from over, but she felt confident that she had steered it toward a meaningful direction. She glanced at her phone, noticing an email from the airline's CEO, offering a personal apology and outlining plans for bias training across the organization. Elaine replied with a succinct but firm message. "Thank you for your commitment. Let's ensure this becomes a model for others to follow." As she set the phone down, she allowed herself a rare moment of pride. She had turned a moment of indignity into a catalyst for change, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, power lies in how one chooses to respond. And Elaine Patterson had chosen to lead. Ripples beyond the flight. The following days unfolded like a crescendo. Justice Elaine Patterson's experience on Flight 872 had become a nationwide conversation, a moment that encapsulated the challenges of implicit bias and systemic inequality. What had started as a confrontation on a plane had grown into a symbol of a larger struggle, a reflection of everyday injustices endured by millions. Elaine sat in her office at the conference venue, the soft hum of city life muffled by the thick glass windows. Papers and emails cluttered her desk, a testament to the whirlwind of reactions her story had ignited. Grace Turner, her assistant, stood nearby, scrolling through her tablet. "The news cycle hasn't let up," Grace said, glancing at Elaine. "Your speech from yesterday is trending on every major platform. Social media's divided, as expected. There's support, outrage, and of course, the usual backlash." Elaine sighed, her fingers interlaced as she leaned back in her chair. "The backlash was inevitable," she said. "But that doesn't mean we should shy away. What's our next move?" Grace tapped her screen, pulling up a list of potential actions. "We've received requests for interviews from several major outlets. Oprah's team reached out. They want to do an exclusive sit-down. And a group of civil rights organizations is asking if you'll headline their upcoming event on racial equity in corporate America." Elaine considered this. She was no stranger to public attention, but she also valued calculated moves. "I don't want this to become a spectacle," she said finally. "The focus has to remain on the larger issue, not just my personal experience." Grace nodded. "Understood. I'll work on framing this as part of a broader initiative." "And what about the airline? They're asking if you'd be willing to meet with their CEO in person." Elaine's eyes narrowed slightly. "Have they made any substantive changes yet, or is this just damage control?" Grace scrolled through her notes. "They've announced mandatory bias training for all employees and are forming a task force to review their customer service policies. It's a start, but it's not enough," Elaine finished. "Schedule the meeting. If they're serious about change, I want to hear it directly from their leadership." Later that afternoon, Elaine met with the airline's CEO, David Langston, in a private conference room at the hotel. Langston was a polished man in his 50s, with a reputation for steering his company through turbulent waters. But today, his usually confident demeanor was tempered with contrition. "Justice Patterson," he began, extending a hand. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me. I want to start by offering my deepest apologies for what you experienced on our flight. It was unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for ensuring it never happens again." Elaine shook his hand, her expression neutral. "Mr. Langston, I appreciate your acknowledgement, but words alone won't suffice. What happened on that flight wasn't an isolated incident. It's indicative of a larger problem within your company's culture. Langston nodded, his jaw tightening. I agree. That's why we've implemented several immediate measures, including mandatory bias training and a review of our hiring practices. But I'd like to hear your perspective on how we can go further. Elaine's gaze was steady. Start by involving the right voices in your decision-making. Partner with organizations that specialize in diversity and inclusion. Create a reporting system that empowers employees and passengers to speak up without fear of retaliation. And most importantly, make your leadership accountable. Change starts at the top. Langston scribbled notes as she spoke, his expression thoughtful. These are actionable steps, he said. I'll make sure our task force incorporates them. And if you're open to it, I'd like to invite you to consult with us as we move forward. Elaine hesitated, considering his offer. While her judicial responsibilities left little time for corporate advisory roles, this was an opportunity to influence real change. I'll consider it, she said finally, but my participation depends on seeing measurable progress. Langston nodded. You have my word. That evening, Elaine found herself reflecting on the meeting. While Langston's promises seemed genuine, she knew how easily good intentions could falter without sustained effort. Change, she had learned, required persistence and vigilance. Her thoughts were interrupted by a notification on her phone. It was a message from Sophia, the young flight attendant who had supported her during the flight. Sophia, Justice Patterson, I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to thank you. Your actions are inspiring change not just in the airline, but among us as employees. I've been speaking with other crew members, and we're forming a coalition to advocate for better training and accountability. You've given us courage. Elaine felt a swell of pride reading the message. Sophia's initiative was a reminder that change often began with individual acts of courage. She replied with a brief but heartfelt message, encouraging Sophia to continue her efforts and promising to stay in touch. The following day, Elaine delivered the closing address at the judicial conference. Her speech was powerful, weaving together themes of equality, accountability, and the responsibility of those in positions of power to create a more just society. But it was the final moments of her address that resonated most deeply. Each of us has a role to play in dismantling the barriers that divide us, she said, her voice steady but impassioned. The law can provide the framework, but it is our collective actions that will determine whether we succeed. Change is not an abstract ideal. It is a daily commitment, a series of choices that require courage, empathy, and persistence. The room erupted into applause, and Elaine stood for a moment, absorbing the energy of the crowd. This was why she had chosen this path, to be a catalyst for change, even in the face of adversity. As the conference concluded, Elaine returned to her suite, where Grace was waiting with a folder of updates. We've received an overwhelming response from attendees, Grace said. Several organizations are already reaching out to collaborate on initiatives inspired by your speech. Elaine smiled faintly, exhaustion creeping into her features. That's good to hear, but let's make sure these collaborations lead to action, not just words. Grace nodded. Of course. And there's one more thing. Your story has inspired a broader conversation. Schools, workplaces, and even community organizations are using it as a teaching moment. It's creating ripples. Elaine leaned back in her chair, her thoughts drifting to the young girl she had once been. The girl who had been told she didn't belong, who had been underestimated time and time again. She had fought hard to prove her worth, not just for herself, but for everyone who faced similar struggles. Now those ripples were turning into waves, and she was ready to keep pushing forward. Waves of change. The ripple effect of Justice Elaine Patterson's experience had grown into a nationwide wave, touching industries, communities, and even legislative discussions. The incident, initially confined to a single flight, had become a flashpoint for conversations on systemic inequality, corporate accountability, and the unseen struggles of those marginalized in society. Elaine sat in her Washington, D.C. chambers a week after returning from New York. Despite the whirlwind of media attention, she had been immersed in her judicial responsibilities, preparing for a critical case on voting rights. The weight of her role as a Supreme Court justice was never far from her mind, but the events of the past week lingered like a shadow. She knew her role in this moment extended beyond the courtroom. On her desk was a stack of letters, some from strangers moved by her story, others from prominent figures offering support. She reached for a letter with elegant handwriting on the envelope. It was from an elementary school teacher in Chicago. The letter read, "Dear Justice Patterson, your story was a powerful reminder to my students that dignity and courage can change the world. Many of them face challenges that make them feel invisible, but when they saw someone like you standing tall in the face of injustice, it lit a fire in them. We've spent the week talking about your journey and how they can channel their struggles into strength. Thank you for showing them what's possible. Sincerely, Mrs. Carla Hayes." Elaine leaned back in her chair, the letter resting in her hands. She had always believed in the power of education and mentorship to create change. To know her story was inspiring young minds reminded her why she had chosen this path, even when it felt isolating. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Grace entered, holding a tablet and a binder. "Justice Patterson, I've compiled the updates you requested on the airline's initiatives," she said. Elaine gestured for her to continue. Grace placed the binder on the desk and opened it. "The airline has launched its new bias training program. It's mandatory for all employees and includes role-playing scenarios to address implicit bias and customer service. They've also partnered with 2 civil rights organizations to develop an internal accountability task force." Elaine nodded, flipping through the binder. "It's a promising start," she said. "But what about the flight attendant, Amanda Walsh?" Grace hesitated. "She's been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. The airline has also offered her the opportunity to participate in the new training programs, but the decision on her future with the company hasn't been finalized." Elaine considered this carefully. While Amanda's actions had been egregious, Elaine believed in restorative justice. The goal wasn't simply to punish, but to educate and transform. "Keep me updated," she said. "I want to know whether she engages with the training." The following day, Elaine addressed a town hall-style event organized by civil rights organizations in D.C. The venue was packed with activists, community leaders, and everyday citizens eager to discuss the broader implications of her experience. The theme was clear: turning outrage into action. As Elaine stepped onto the stage, the audience rose in a standing ovation. She held up her hand to signal for quiet, her presence commanding yet approachable. "Thank you," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I stand here today not as a Supreme Court justice, but as a fellow advocate for change. What happened to me on that flight is something countless others experience every day, often with far less recourse. This isn't just my story. It's ours." Her words resonated deeply as she recounted the incident, framing it as a microcosm of larger systemic issues. But she didn't stop at the problem. She offered solutions. "Accountability starts with recognizing the humanity in every person," she said. "Whether you're a corporation, a school, or a small community, the question isn't whether bias exists. It's what you're doing to address it. Policies are a start, but culture is where the real work happens." Elaine then opened the floor to questions. A young woman in the audience stood, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "Justice Patterson, how do you stay hopeful when it feels like progress is so slow?" Elaine smiled gently. "Hope isn't passive," she said. "It's not something we wait for. It's something we build. Progress may be slow, but every step forward matters. And when you see even a small change, a child inspired, a policy adjusted, a conversation sparked, that's where hope lives." After the event, Elaine stayed to meet attendees. Among them was a middle-aged man who introduced himself as Michael, a pilot for the same airline involved in the incident. His face was lined with regret as he spoke. Justice Patterson, I wanted to personally apologize, he said. I wasn't on that flight, but as someone who's been with the airline for 20 years, I feel responsible. We should have been better. Elaine placed a reassuring hand on his arm. Michael, change doesn't happen overnight, she said. What matters is your commitment moving forward. Use your position to advocate for the kind of culture you want to see. He nodded, his resolve evident. I will. Thank you for your grace. The media attention continued to swirl, but Elaine was deliberate in how she engaged. She granted a single exclusive interview to a respected journalist, focusing on the systemic issues highlighted by her experience rather than the personal details. The interview aired during prime time and reached millions, sparking a renewed wave of discussions. In it, Elaine said, "Injustice thrives in silence. By speaking up, we challenge not only the behavior, but the systems that allow it to persist. And by standing together, we make it clear that such behavior has no place in our society." As the weeks turned into months, tangible results began to emerge. The airline's initiatives gained momentum, setting a precedent that other corporations started to follow. The coalition of flight attendants, led by Sophia, gained traction, advocating for stronger protections and better training industry-wide. Meanwhile, Elaine continued her judicial work, balancing the demands of her role with her growing influence as a voice for equality. She knew the fight was far from over, but she also knew the power of persistence. One evening, as she prepared to leave her chambers, she received another message from Sophia. Sophia, Justice Patterson, I thought you'd like to know. Amanda attended the bias training. She's been reaching out to apologize to the crew and is working with us on the coalition. Thank you for believing people can change. Elaine's lips curved into a faint smile. It was a reminder that progress wasn't always linear, but it was possible. And in a world where change often felt elusive, moments like these were proof that it was worth fighting for. A legacy of change. Months after the incident on Flight 872, Justice Elaine Patterson found herself in a familiar position, straddling the line between public figure and private citizen. Her experience had sparked a wave of conversations, policies, and personal reflections across the country, but she was acutely aware that the fight against systemic bias and inequality was far from over. She sat in her chambers on a crisp spring morning, sunlight spilling through the tall windows and illuminating the stacks of legal briefs on her desk. Today's docket included cases on voting rights, workplace discrimination, and equitable education funding, issues she had fought for her entire career. Yet her mind kept drifting to the broader societal changes that had unfolded since her fateful flight. The airline where the incident had occurred had undergone a remarkable transformation. Its leadership, galvanized by Elaine's direct involvement, and the widespread backlash, had taken sweeping measures to reform its internal culture. Mandatory bias training had been implemented across all levels of the company, and a new reporting system allowed employees and passengers to report incidents anonymously, ensuring accountability without fear of retaliation. Sophia, the young flight attendant who had quietly supported Elaine on the plane, had risen as a leader within the airline's diversity task force. She had become a powerful advocate, organizing forums where employees could share their experiences and help shape the company's evolving policies. Elaine had kept in touch with Sophia, mentoring her from afar and encouraging her to continue the hard work of creating change from within. As for Amanda Walsh, the flight attendant whose actions had set everything in motion, her journey was one of redemption. After completing the airline's intensive bias training, Amanda had reached out to Elaine through the airline's task force. Her letter, handwritten and heartfelt, expressed genuine remorse. Dear Justice Patterson, I owe you an apology, not just for my actions on that flight, but for the assumptions I made about you, and the ways I let my own biases guide my behavior. Since that day, I've been reflecting deeply, and the training has opened my eyes to the harm I caused, not just to you, but to others I may have treated unfairly without realizing it. I am committed to being better, and I thank you for showing grace in a situation where I showed none. Sincerely, Amanda Walsh. Elaine had read the letter carefully, her emotions a mix of sadness, relief, and cautious hope. She hadn't responded immediately, wanting to see if Amanda's actions would align with her words. Over time, however, Amanda had proven herself sincere, becoming an active participant in the airline's diversity initiatives and even volunteering to lead workshops on implicit bias. Outside of the airline industry, Elaine's story had continued to inspire broader movements. Educational institutions across the country began integrating discussions of implicit bias and systemic inequality into their curricula. Corporate leaders reached out to Elaine, asking for advice on how to implement meaningful diversity and inclusion programs. Community organizations saw a surge in volunteers, people who had been moved by her story and wanted to make a difference in their own spheres of influence. One such organization was the Justice Collective, a grassroots network focused on promoting equity in underserved communities. They had asked Elaine to serve as their honorary advisor, a role she had accepted with enthusiasm. Through the collective, she worked on initiatives ranging from mentoring young lawyers to advocating for legislative reforms aimed at reducing economic and racial disparities. 1 year to the day after the incident, Elaine attended a special event hosted by the Justice Collective. It was held in her honor, celebrating not only her achievements as a Supreme Court justice, but also her unwavering commitment to justice outside the courtroom. The venue, a sprawling community center in Atlanta, was filled with people whose lives had been touched by her work. As Elaine stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted into applause. She stood at the podium, her gaze sweeping across the room. Faces of all ages and backgrounds looked back at her, some familiar, others new. It was a moment of profound connection, a reminder that the fight for equality was shared by many. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Tonight isn't about me. It's about the power we have when we come together to confront injustice, to challenge the systems and attitudes that divide us, and to create a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect." She paused, letting her words settle. 1 year ago, I was reminded of how far we still have to go. But I was also reminded of something even more important: the capacity for change. Change doesn't come easily, and it doesn't come quickly. It requires persistence, courage, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But it is possible, and each of us has a role to play. Her speech wove together stories of progress and resilience, highlighting the efforts of people like Sophia, Amanda, and the countless others who had stepped up in the wake of her experience. By the time she finished, the audience was on its feet, their applause a thunderous affirmation of her message. After the event, Elaine mingled with attendees, listening to their stories and sharing her own insights. She met a young woman named Tamara, a first-year law student who had been inspired to pursue a legal career after watching Elaine's interview on national television. "I want to fight for people like you do," Tamara said, her eyes shining with determination. "To make sure no one has to feel invisible." Elaine placed a hand on her shoulder. "You already have what it takes," she said. "The key is to never lose sight of why you started. And remember, change is a marathon, not a sprint. Stay the course." As the evening wound down, Elaine returned to her hotel room, exhausted but fulfilled. She changed into comfortable clothes and stepped out onto the balcony, the city lights twinkling like stars against the night sky. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply breathe, to reflect on how far she had come, not just in the past year, but throughout her life. Her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Grace, sharing an update from the Justice Collective. They had just secured funding to launch a new mentorship program for young people in underserved communities. Elaine smiled, her heart swelling with pride. This was the work that mattered. Not the headlines, not the accolades, but the tangible, lasting impact on people's lives. The legacy she was building wasn't just about her. It was about empowering others to carry the torch of justice forward. And as she stood there, gazing out at the vast expanse of lights, she felt a quiet but unshakable certainty. The waves of change she had helped to set in motion would continue, reaching places she could never have imagined. And in that, she found her peace.